Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second presentation in the Rogers Tavern Museum Spring Lecture Series. My name is Jennifer Pitts. I'm an independent museum consultant working with the town of Perryville at the Rogers Tavern Museum. The museum is situated along the banks of the beautiful Susquehanna River in Perryville, Maryland. We're located about 43 miles from the city of Baltimore and 34 miles from Wilmington, Delaware. The Susquehanna Lower Ferry and an ordinary or tavern was formally established by the Maryland colonial government in 1695 on both sides of the Susquehanna River because of its location on a major overland transportation route connecting the eastern and southern colonial capitals and seaports. The building that became known as Rogers Tavern was built in 1771 and provided a place for travelers to rest and eat and for locals to conduct business, catch up on the news of the day, and enjoy drinking with coworkers and friends until sometime in the 1880s, when it ceased operation as a tavern/hotel/summer boarding establishment and was converted into a duplex housing unit. Rogers Tavern was saved from demolition by the organization now known as Preservation Maryland in 1954. The Friends of Rogers Tavern subsequently formed to renovate the building with the goal to return it to its 18th century appearance. Placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1972, it was purchased by the town of Perryville in 1993. The mission of the Rogers Tavern Museum is to preserve and share the imitable stories of all who lived, worked at, and visited this vital link along an important roadway in America's early history through dynamic, engaging experiences that encourage exploration of our area's rich cultural and natural legacy. All lectures are recorded and will be made available to the public on the Rogers Tavern Museum website and on YouTube. Please enter your questions in the chat box or the Q&A below. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Stephanie Soder. Stephanie is the research archaeologist for the Maryland Historical Trust. She received her master's degree in maritime studies at East Carolina University and has experience working on both terrestrial and underwater sites. Her interests include conflict archaeology, maritime history, public archaeology, and geophysical survey techniques. She and other archaeologists at the Office of Archaeology are responsible for researching, documenting, and preserving archaeological sites across the state. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my slide for you. I hope you all can see that now. All right, so thank you so much for that introduction. I just want to start by saying a little announcement, and that as if you didn't know, April is Maryland Archaeology Month, so happy Archaeology Month, everybody. And thanks so much for joining me this evening. I'm going to talk with you all about the Maryland Historical Trust's current project focused on studying the cultural resources of the Washington and Rochambeau military encampments in Cecil and Harford County. So I'm first going to talk about the goals of the project, so you all kind of get an understanding of what we're aiming to do with this particular project. And then I'm going to give a general historical overview of the encampments and the troop movement throughout Harford and Cecil counties. And I will talk a little about archaeological integrity and our roadmap for trying to identify encampment-related sites through archaeology. And then finally, I'll give you an update on how the project has been going so far, because MHT and our volunteers have been pretty busy over the last year getting some of this survey completed, which has been really great. So this is our overall project goals for this that was worked into our grant proposal to the National Park Service specifically for this project. And that is to locate and document cultural resources associated with encampment sites of the combined forces of the Continental Army under General Washington and the French Expedition Particulière as they pass through Cecil and Harford counties. I'm going to apologize now. I took German all through high school and college, so my French pronunciation is pretty horrific. So no offense intended. I will try to pronounce as best as I can some of the French words and names, but please forgive me ahead of time. In addition to that goal, we are also looking at the archaeological and architectural resources that were present at the time of the march to Yorktown in 1781, and then their return trip in 1782 through those counties. So the Maryland Historical Trust is who I work for, and we were awarded a little over $68,000 in funding from the American Battlefield Protection Program, which is nestled underneath of the National Park Service, in order to carry out this task. So I'm going to point out this thing at the bottom. It's essentially them saying, the National Park Service, that they are funding us, but any findings or opinions or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the authors. It's going to be here throughout the whole entire presentation, but I just wanted to point that out to you in advance, just in case you see it. And then MHT is actually the state agency dedicated to preserving and interpreting the legacy of Maryland's past through research and conservation and education. And we are also the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO for short. And it's also the home of the State Office of Archaeology. So us being in this position, we felt that we were pretty well suited for taking up this particular research question. And apparently the American Battlefield Protection Program agreed, as they gave us the funding to do this. So the individual project objectives that we laid out help us meet that overall goal that was on the previous slide. So the first objective we had was to conduct a GIS and archival desk audit of our archaeological sites that we know. Basically, this was just our attempt to scour the records for maps and other documentation and see if we could geo-rectify some of those maps onto the modern landscape and see if we could figure out where the encampments may be. We also searched through our current records to see if anything kind of jumped out at us, either just individual finds that people had reported throughout the years or known sites, and anything like that. So that second goal is to carry out geophysical remote sensing and aerial drone surveys at encampment-related sites. And we'll talk a little bit later about what types of surveys we decided to go with, but at this stage, it was completely non-disturbance, so we were not putting any shovels in the ground at this point. However, the next step is to conduct ground truthing test excavations at the two most promising sites, one hopefully in Harford County and one in Cecil County. And then we'd also be carrying out architectural research to support one National Register nomination and one National Register update for historic standing structures that were present in 1781 and 1782. Now, these last two objectives were primarily what the money was going to be moving towards, because we have all of our geophysical survey equipment and the manpower to conduct those surveys. And then that money was going to go towards hiring a consultant to perform the excavations and then separately to do the National Register forms. So here at the outset, I'm going to go into the historic background, but I really want to acknowledge the work of Dr. Robert Selig. He is a historian with the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Group, and he laid out and clarified a lot of what I'll cover in the next few slides in his various historical landscape studies that were related to the route. He's kind of hit sites all up and down this route, not just in Maryland. So he was really key to us kind of understanding this troop movement and how they went from basically all the way north, all the way down south to Yorktown. So Expedition Particulière was the official code name for the plan to bring the French troops to America. And there had been some unofficial support, mostly through supplying arms and officers by prominent French politicians and individuals within the Kingdom of France. In the government, excuse me. Sorry, did not mean to do that. Where was I? Oh, right. So unofficial support. And for example, Lafayette was in America by 1777. So the unofficial support kind of started in 1775. But it wasn't until February 6th of 1778, with the signing of the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance, that it actually became official. And they came out and said, yeah, we'll support the American cause for independence. So the expedition actually left Brest, France on May 2nd, 1780, so kind of late into the war already. The expedition landed in Narragansett Bay in Newport, Rhode Island on July 11th, 1780. And this French military force was 5,800 men, and that was under the control, and I'm just going to call him Rochambeau because I am not even going to attempt to pronounce his name properly, but the Comte de Rochambeau, they were under his command. Along with them were 450 officers, 4,171 NCOs and soldiers who were mostly infantry. There were 510 artillery specialists, 36 artillery workers, 23 engineers, and 610 mercenaries and foreign fighters, basically German, Polish, and Irish descent. And the mercenaries and the foreign fighters made up Lauzun's Legion, again, pronunciation, and that consisted of infantry, light cavalry, and artillery units. This was essentially a mini army within the army, and they were kind of conceived of as a unit of shock troops that France could stand up into the field at a moment's notice. So many of these soldiers were actually sick from the journey because it is about a 1.5 to 2 month journey, and they were suffering from scurvy and other transport-related diseases. So ultimately, only 4,200 French fighters would make that journey to Yorktown, and the rest remained in the hospital in New England. So because of that, the French really didn't see any action until 1780. They immediately went into winter quarters in November, and like I said before, a lot of them were recovering in the hospital. So the healthy French forces combined with about 6,000 American soldiers, and they began probing New York City from positions in White Plains, New York by July of 1781. And there was originally this plan to kind of besiege New York, which was considered the heart of British control in North America. But it was very much an occupied city at the time. But General Washington was not convinced that those combined armies could besiege New York. He did not think it would be a good idea. And then French Admiral Francois Joseph Paul de Grasse informed General Washington on August 14th that he was going to be sailing to the Chesapeake Bay and not to New York to assist with this attempt of a siege. And that sealed the deal for Washington. So he decided they're going to head south for the summer 1781 campaign. So a little bit of background on why Admiral de Grasse headed to the Chesapeake instead of New York. You know, he could have, in theory, but at the time, British General Cornwallis had been ordered to the Chesapeake to construct a new port in Virginia that would help support a land invasion to attack Philadelphia. And so the Marquis de Lafayette, who was then a major general in the Continental Army, he spent that summer of 1781 kind of evading Cornwallis in Virginia and, you know, basically making a mess of things, kind of making it difficult for him to do this task. But in August, while heading north to join the planned attack on New York, Lafayette received word at the head of Elk to return to Virginia and keep Cornwallis pinned down because they decided to come. So Washington and Rochambeau began to move their men south to meet up with the troop transports at the head of Elk for an attack at Yorktown. General Washington ended up leaving nearly 3,500 American troops in New York to kind of keep the British forces up there contained. So the combined forces moving south consisted of approximately 2,700 Americans and 4,200 French troops, and they were marching to the Chesapeake to board those vessels at Head of Elk. So here is actually a map that was prepared by a man named Louis Alexandre Berthier, and this shows the encampment sites within Cecil and Harford counties during the 1781 trip to Yorktown and the 1782 return trip. Previously I mentioned that the original plan was to march to the Head of Elk, board vessels there, and then head down to Yorktown. And Head of Elk is actually modern-day Elkton, for those who don't know. But unfortunately, it doesn't work out that way. And when Washington arrived at Head of Elk, he discovers that they don't have anywhere near the number of vessels that they need to move all of those troops down there. And possibly part of this issue was because there was a major naval battle occurring at the head of the Chesapeake. And Admiral de Grasse had engaged the British Navy on September 5th and won a very decisive victory that kept the British from being able to reinforce Cornwallis's positions, but that kept vessels down there, you know, basically keeping the British occupied. So there were only enough vessels available for most of the American troops and a small portion of the French army to go that route. So the rest would have to travel on foot. And this map shows the major stops along that trek across land. But as we'll see in the next few slides, things were a lot more complicated than what they seem just based on this map. You know, it looks very clean, very, you know, we're going to keep moving here, and then we're going to stop here and here and here. It wasn't really like that. So we're going to transition to a modern map of the area. So this is where we're at right now. And this is the region on September 5th, 1781. And this is as that battle is raging on the sea down at the mouth of the Chesapeake. And on September 6th, that's when we have the first arrive at Head of Elk. Those are Americans that actually arrive. And then on September 7th, the first French brigade arrives, excuse me. And then on the 8th, the second French brigade arrives. So then we have September 9th, and this is when things start to move a little bit more. So on the 9th, after a couple of days of rest for some, only an overnight rest for others, because again, they were kind of coming in waves, the French army set out west and south from here. So an important point to remember is that the army didn't just consist of soldiers, but it also was a massive baggage train and all of the supplies, livestock, and camp followers that would have moved across the landscape with them. So the French split up with the infantry units following the main route along the head of the bay to Lower Tavern, which is Rogers Tavern, and Harmerstown, which is Havre de Grace, and then the light cavalry of Lauzun's Legion, the horse-drawn artillery, and the tent and supply wagons hauled by large teams of oxen actually headed north to ford the Susquehanna at Baldfriar, as you can see up here. Excuse me. And then on the 10th, the infantry had moved on to Bushtown, and the 2nd New York Regiment had reached Harmerstown. And the supply lines to the north were in an extremely confused state. So the horse-drawn artillery actually had moved at double time to catch back up with the infantry, and they arrived just as the French troops were breaking camp to head on to White Marsh. And then the tent and supply wagons were encamped at Indian Spring, and the Deer Creek Church and the light cavalry had made a wrong turn somewhere. So they took a very poor road and ended up in the Poplar Grove area in Harford County. So it's important to note at this point that it's actually been widely believed that when the French were talking about the Deer Creek Church in their journals, they were talking about the Deer Creek Meeting House in Harford County, which does still exist. It existed at the time. It then burned down in 1784 and was rebuilt. However, MHT is currently pursuing a second line of inquiry that the Deer Creek Church that they were talking about was actually the Deer Creek Mission, which is situated in Indian Spring. And the distances marched from Cummings Tavern and noted in the French journals match much more closely to that. It is also possible that this is the reason why they took the wrong road, because there are two churches in that area considered the Deer Creek Church. So something we're kind of pursuing that's a little bit of a new kind of avenue of approach in our research that we've conducted. So on September 11th, 1781, this is where everybody kind of is. And then on the 12th, we're moving forward a little bit. The 2nd New York goes to White Marsh while everyone else is catching up. And then this is on the 13th, and those American troops were still sailing, and the American baggage train came across in the same area. And on the 14th, they essentially kind of got back on track. So the French had marched and were heading down towards White Marsh, Maryland. So this is on the 15th. Excuse me. And here we are at the end of September. Well, sorry, backtracking. So at the end of September, the Battle of Yorktown began. So for 3 weeks, both sides, the British and the Americans and their allies, fought for control in Yorktown, and finally outnumbered and outfought during that 3-week siege. They sustained great losses. The British actually surrendered to the Continental Army and their French allies, and about a month after the end of the battle, the American baggage train made their way back north. So here we are on November 20th, 1781. And thankfully, people were taking notes and journals while they were moving. And so they stopped in Harmerstown or in Havre de Grace. They then crossed the Susquehanna, came through Charlestown, which is where I currently am right now, and headed their way up to Head of Elk. And this is on the 24th. The New York and the New Jersey regiments actually started making their way north with the British prisoners of war. They stopped in Swan Creek, and then the New Jersey regiment continued on to the Head of Elk, where they kind of set up shop with their British POWs. They split up, and then the New York regiment and their prisoners of war caught back up with them at Head of Elk. So now the French military this whole time and continuing into the winter actually stayed in Virginia, and then they made their way north in August of 1782. So here we are on August 25th. As they make their way north, they stop over in Bushtown, just like they did on their way south. And then they keep going forward up to Lower Ferry, again, Rogers Tavern. Unfortunately, there aren't as many primary documents about this movement north as there is moving south, but we know it looked a lot like that movement in the sense that it was kind of 4 different groups moving one day behind each one. So they were coming in waves. So while one troop group made their way in Bushtown, the next morning they left, that next group would come and camp in Bushtown while the next ones were up. So it kind of looked like essentially a long chain of movement of them going up. Excuse me. So they all ended up at Head of Elk once more on September 1st, 1782. So this map here actually presents a much more complex but also more accurate listing of all the encampments that were established during 1781 and 1782. The ones that are shown on the 1782 map are those that are bolded here. But in looking at not just the maps of the period, but also other archival records, we have evidence for these encampments that at least some portion of the army visited. Excuse me. And then the ones that are highlighted here in white, we actually have detailed site maps that show evidence of where on these landscapes the troops were situated. So looking back at this map that we saw earlier, that is all thanks to the man who did it, Louis Alexander Berthier, who was a staff officer to General Rochambeau and was part of the advance party that scouted out these locations for the army to stop at. So not only did he produce this overview map, but he also painted watercolors of his maps, which were actually pretty accurate. So they're not to scale, but because they were made very quickly in the field, but they do provide the locations where artillery units and French troops were situated. Unfortunately, locations of the American troops are not shown on these maps in Maryland because at that point, remember, they had been split up and the American troops were trailing far behind. So as you can see here, we have the 1781 encampment on the left and the 1782 encampment on the right at Head of Elk, or now Elkton. And here's Lower Ferry, which is, again, where we have our Rogers Tavern, and Harmerstown, which is now Havre de Grace in 1781 and 1782. You can kind of see both sides of the river there. And then here is Bushtown, which is in Abingdon right now. And these are both in 1781 and 1782. So now we're going to switch gears a little, take a kind of hard pivot to talk about how we will approach the deliverables for this grant using archaeology and specifically remote sensing. Again, those fancy techniques that allow us to kind of get a peek beneath the ground surface without digging. But before getting into that approach, first I want to talk a little bit about archaeological integrity. So does an archaeological site remain undisturbed, preserving the potential to yield specific data that addresses important research questions? This is one of the criteria for listing a site on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's the criterion most often cited for archaeological sites because the way archaeology is erroneously portrayed on like TV and in pop culture and news media and elsewhere, people often have this notion about the goals and purposes of the field. People tend to think of archaeology as the search for interesting objects for museums, but I really want to encourage you to think of archaeology differently. We have this slide in almost every presentation that MHT gives to the public. And the important thing in this, the most important image on this screen right now is that middle one right here. If you guys can see my little laser pointer right here, that is the most important one. And that's because it is showing field notes. So we take meticulous notes all the time for every single work that we do, all work that we do. And that's because archaeology is a destructive science, which means we only have one chance to get it right. We need to make sure we're taking great notes so that we can analyze it later. So we're trying to focus less on the search for objects, so to speak, and artifacts, and more on the search for information. So kind of think of it more like crime scene investigation. And that focuses as much more on where the objects are in relation to each other and how they all come together to tell a story together. So that's really, really important when thinking about archaeological integrity and whether or not a site can actually give us a lot of detail. So as mentioned before, the first overall step in our methodology for this project is to do GIS desk auditing. So Geographic Information Systems software allows for the capture, storage, examination, and display of complex classes of spatial data that is relative to the Earth's surface. So everything in archaeology is about spatial relationships. It's not about what you find as much as where you find it. And it's the context of what you find that really tells us the story and what gives it meaning. So GIS also allows us to georectify historic maps and relate them to a location as it appears today, which is what we did with all of the Berthier maps that you saw earlier. So for example, I'll show you the one for Bushtown and what that looks like. So here we have Mr. Berthier looking over our shoulder, and we're looking down at currently modern day Bushtown or Abingdon. And then this is the 1781 map on the modern landscape. And then this is the 1782 map on the modern landscape. So you can kind of see where those yellow is. I'll back up a little too. So where those yellow markers are, that's where the troops were. And over here, you can kind of see it right here, if you can see my laser pointer. And then we also pull in LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging data. And this kind of shows more detail of the landscape that you might not be able to see because the trees are in the way or things like that. So you can see the waterways very clearly here. And this is where those troops were actually staying. The maps we just looked at, you can now see them all together on this one single map with the LiDAR. And the Moulin is mill. And L'Auberge is in, so we have the mill that we know existed there, as well as the Bush Hotel, which still is standing as well. So this is our nice georectified map. So talking about those geophysical survey techniques I was talking about earlier, I want to show you guys what we were kind of looking at in terms of possibilities of how we were going to be doing this remote sensing. So once we took that data before, I'll move back, taking this data, figuring out how we wanted to georectify things on the current landscape, and figuring out where we might want to do this survey so that we're not just randomly doing survey. So the first way we were thinking about doing this was using metal detector. Now, metal detectors get kind of a bad reputation, especially with archaeologists, but it's one of those tools that it's not the tool itself, it's how it's used. And metal detecting can be a very, very important piece of instrumentation in our arsenal, especially when looking for sites of conflict. So metal detecting is the use of an instrument that detects the nearby presence of metal. Pretty simple. It is very good for establishing metallic debris distribution at a site, which can help you establish site boundaries. It can locate buried trash deposits or structural remains. And there are some easy to use models. There are more advanced ones, which we do have. And again, like I said, that's really good for battlefield sites. And so the data itself is not post-processed without another form of mapping. So if you detect something in the ground, you have to mark it with either like a pin flag and then immediately map it in with a GPS. It doesn't just kind of collect the data that you can then put up on your computer for later. It also does not give you depth. Some models do show a depth, but it's not very accurate, but it can provide material information. So if you listen to the sounds that it's making, you can determine if something is lead, if it's aluminum, if it's steel, things like that, which is really, really nice. So if you ping a aluminum can, you know exactly what that sounds like, and you're like, okay, I don't have to dig that up. And this kind of survey can be carried out in wooded areas, which is really, really nice because not every bit of survey equipment that we have is very forest friendly, if I can word it that way. So this is a great technique when it's coupled with that high precision GPS data collection that I said. So that's one way we look at sites or can look for sites. This is an example of one way we have done it before. This is out at Fort Frederick. We did a controlled metal detection survey in April of 2022. We had volunteers come out who knew how to use their metal detectors and use them well, and they came out for a day and they were marking everything with a pin flag. The object was recorded, and then they were actually digging it up to see what it was. And they were taking great meticulous notes, so we were able to map everything that was found in relation to where it is to the fort. And this is just north of the fort itself. And actually, the part in the woods, we ended up doing some excavation at in the form of shovel test pits later. And as you can see, that was a little tough to see, but there are an awful lot of blue triangles for architecture, and I believe it's the blue circles for personal. In that area, not so much arms, some arms, but not a whole lot. But most of it is actually domestic related, and the artifacts we were finding were more domestic related. So we actually think that's a house site back there. So that's just one of the ways we can figure out and how to use metal detection to find these sites that we didn't know existed. Magnetic susceptibility is another way that we usually survey, and this measures the degree to which soils become magnetized in response to an applied magnetic field. So the instrument in her hands, as you can see, is facing towards the ground, and it does emit a little pulse, and she is taking a reading. It'll give her a couple of numbers, and then he is writing down those numbers. You then put it into the computer to post-process, and it kind of shows up as a heat map. So the green will be your normal soil, and then if it's yellow or red, that's where you're going to see a lot of things that it might be important to you. So this detects the changes in the magnetic properties of the soil, and it's really good for identifying where soil has been disturbed, where burning has occurred, and where organic materials like bone and wood are incorporated. This is a really great way to rapidly collect data in a very large area because you're doing it about every 5 meters, and it takes maybe 20 seconds to do each reading. So it's very, very fast. It's also very easy to learn. So we have our volunteers do this type of survey collection on our behalf a lot of the time because it's a very easy tool to use. It also can be used in wooded areas. Again, that's really important, especially when you're working with these encampment sites that are pretty small. But it does not show you the exact feature or size or shape. So you don't know what you're looking at. You just kind of get a general hotspot. So you kind of have to always do ground truthing of some sort, either excavation or shovel test pits to determine what you're looking at. Another form of survey we use is the flux gate gradiometry, and this measures local variations in the natural magnetic field by using 2 mounted sensors and measuring the gradient between them. So you can see them in this picture, kind of looks like a TIE fighter from Star Wars. And he walks along that line at a specific pace so that it can collect this data. And what this does is that it detects patterns, the presence of metallic artifacts, features containing soils with slightly elevated magnetic oxides, or features like walls, roads, and ditches that are just below the surface. And this is a passive way to survey. So just the other one was emitting something to take the reading. This is just measuring it as you go. So it's a passive piece of equipment. It also does not identify the type of feature or disturbance, similar to the magnetic susceptibility meter. And modern debris can actually cause a lot of interference, and that can obscure the more subtler anomalies. So you might get a flare when there really shouldn't be one, or there might be a bigger flare, even though there's something smaller underneath of it that kind of like shields it. And this is really only suitable for open fields. As you can see, he's walking in a big open field. The grass is a little tall, but this is definitely not for wooded areas. And again, you do have to ground truth these results to make sure that because it basically looks like a big white spot on your data. So you don't know the shape or size, and you have to end up digging into the ground to check it. Our fourth type of survey method that we use is ground penetrating radar. And this is probably the one that most people are more familiar with because of, crime shows and things like that. They often show it. And what this does is it transmits an electromagnetic energy, which is a very high frequency radio pulse into the ground, and it measures the amount of energy that is reflected back and the time it takes to reach the surface. So the really nice thing about this piece of equipment is that it provides depth information and high resolution imagery. So if there is a foundation, in your, area that you're surveying, you are going to see the outline of it as it is, and you're going to know at what depth it is. Our GPR usually goes to about 2 meters, so as long as it's anything above that, we will get a really good picture of it. So we can probably tell what the feature is based on what we're looking at. But again, we should always ground truth it regardless of if we think we know what it is, because we've seen some things that we thought were, something, and then it ended up not being that at all. So it's always good to ground truth your results. The only reason that we don't use this all the time is because it is very time consuming, especially when you're in a wooded setting. It's not that you can't use it in the woods, but it becomes very difficult and takes a very long time. It's also very complex to interpret. You have to have special software, and you really need to know what you're looking at. And it does not do well in wet clay. So as you can see in this picture, it kind of looks like he's mowing the lawn, and that's exactly what it looks like. It just looks like somebody is very slowly mowing the lawn in 25 or 50 centimeter increments. So you go down the lawn, you turn around, you bring it back to that start line, and you do it again. So that's why we don't use it for everything. Sometimes we'll use the magnetic susceptibility meter and the gradiometer first to try to narrow down areas of interest, those hot spots, and then we would do the GPR to make sure that we're getting better data. So how might this be applied to the encampments when they are fairly ephemeral short-term settlements? And so the first thing to note is that we're not just interested in the encampments. We really do want to find them, but we're also just looking for resources that would have been present at the time of the encampments anyway. So mills, taverns, iron furnaces, dwellings, slave quarters, pretty much anything that would have been around at that time. There is also one class of structure from the encampments that may have left a permanent trace on the landscape that we should be able to detect with these techniques, and that is camp kitchens or these earthen bread ovens. So not only do we hope that these could be picked up by the GPR, but this is why the magnetic susceptibility survey becomes important, because as I said earlier, that is really good at picking up where areas have been burned. So hopefully we were hoping to find some of these with the GPR and the magnetic susceptibility meter. We also can see tent pole holes, where tent uprights may have been if there were post holes. So those are the other types of things we could be looking for. So taking all of that into consideration, starting last July and working through this fall and winter, we have hit 5 different areas with a combination of these tactics. We don't always use all 4. Usually we'll use 3. We have so far not used metal detection because we are still waiting for confirmation from the National Park Service that we can do that under the grant stipulations, because we originally put that the geophysical survey would not be ground disturbing. But with the metal detector, we kind of need it to be ground disturbing to see that what we're finding is actually relevant to the Revolutionary War. So we hope that we can do the metal detection a little later in some of these areas that might benefit from further work. So the first place that we surveyed was in Elkton at the Evans McKinney Park. And so when georectifying the map, the encampment, the 1782 encampment, looked to sit right at this area. So in July of 2024, we went out and conducted the magnetic susceptibility meter and the ground penetrating radar survey in this field. So this is actually the magnetic susceptibility survey results. Like I said, they show hot spots. It's green where the soil is pretty normal. It's yellow or red where you might have some sort of disturbance or maybe burning or something like that. So it's very much like a heat map. And so really there wasn't a whole lot going on here except for that very edge of the field there, and that was getting more close to the woods. So it could have been related to the trees, but we weren't really sure. But then we added in our ground penetrating radar survey results, which you can see here, and it got a little more interesting. So as you can see, let me see if I can pull anything. Right here, it seems to be a historic road trace, and then there are 3 very similar rectangular anomalies. Now, these anomalies were about 15 feet across, which is about the same size of the French bread ovens, which could also be rectangular. So if you remember in the photos, they were more circular, but they could be rectangular as well. So as you can imagine, we were pretty excited about this. We had looked at the 1938, the 1952, and the 1985 historic aerials along with earlier maps, and there was nothing noted in this area. So this really led us to believe that it could be an earlier road trace and anomalies. However, since then, we were able to track down some additional historic aerials from the mid-20th century. So it looks like it was after 1952, because again, we saw those aerials and there was nothing going on there. But before 1956, a pull-off and a picnic area was built along that stretch of road. And it does appear in the 1959 aerials and in the 1972 aerials that you see here. The road is very clear, but the interior area between the main road and the pull-off road is a little fuzzy, though there's definitely something going on there. However, based on a 1956 newspaper clipping that I found, our guess is that those square anomalies are concrete pads or packed earth for picnic tables and maybe fireplaces. Thankfully, the article actually noted Elkton specifically because it was one of only 6 that had a fishing pond included with the picnic area throughout the whole state. So that was a little bit disappointing. We really were hoping that we had something there, but this is why it's important to do your background research. But you know, it could be a really cool transportation archaeology project going on later, but definitely not related to the Revolutionary War. We also did do survey at Booth Street in Elkton. However, that area had been so disturbed that nothing flared at all in our magnetic susceptibility meter or our ground penetrating radar survey. So unfortunately, that means we likely did not find anything related to the Rochambeau encampments, at least in the areas that we surveyed. However, with that flare in the top corner and the likelihood of no disturbance in the woods near the stream, because that has been consistently wooded throughout all of the imagery that we found, we are looking into the possibility of metal detecting in that area once we receive the National Park Service approval and when the vegetation has died back a little bit. So there might be something going on there, hopefully. So then moving on to Elk Landing. So we started in August of 2024, making our way over to Elk Landing to conduct all 3 types of survey, so the magnetic susceptibility, the gradiometer, and the ground penetrating radar. And about halfway through the week, we got rained out, which was really interesting because we had a day of extreme heat that we were able to work our way through. But then it started pouring rain the next day, which our equipment does not like to work in the rain. So we had to postpone until we could come back, which was in late October. So as you can see, we have the bright greenery on the left-hand side, and then we've got our nice fall foliage on the right. So this area is a bit of a challenge because we know there was activity here for the onboarding of the troops throughout the Revolutionary War, but it also saw action during the War of 1812. There was an earthen fort that was constructed in defense of Elkton. And then there was also a boat works on site in the late 19th and early 20th century by the wharf. So unlike those other areas previously, that we were talking about in McKinney Park, there was a lot going on here. So it wasn't just a blank slate, basically. So we did do more survey in areas than just this block of 6 that you see here. We did more survey up along the wharf and up behind the house in Elk Landing, but there really wasn't anything there except for modern electrical lines that you could see running underneath. So this is the GPR data. And I'll show you the gradiometer data as well in the south section. And we did get some pretty interesting overlapping anomalies. So there does seem to be this semicircle of post holes. Hopefully you guys can see my laser right here in this first grid. We at first thought this might be from a tent of some sort, but the arc is about 50 feet across, which is too big for a Revolutionary War tent, even for a hospital tent. And then there's this other anomaly over here. It kind of looks like a trench feature, and it does, when you look at the data vertically, then you can see that it actually goes down to about 1.5 meters deep. So it's not just a single line. They are pretty deep. And then, excuse me, this kind of area right here is a little bit bigger. And then if you pull up the gradiometer data, I'll go back to that. You see that that flare is in the same exact spot, and then there's also a flare kind of near that arc, as you saw here. The magnetic susceptibility meter heat map that you see here does show a little bit of something going on right there. And then it starts to kind of turn red over here. This we're not really sure about. It could be modern related. You don't really see a whole lot going on up here in the GPR data. The one thing I will note though with this is right here. Hopefully you guys can't see my laser, otherwise I'm just hoping you can tell what I'm talking about. This line right here, we believe this is actually related to archaeological excavations that were completed, I think, in 2009 at Elk Landing, specifically looking for that earthen fort. And you can see it in the 2010 aerials where they backfilled, and it's still kind of the grass is trying to grow back up again. So we know, and it lines up perfectly. So we're pretty sure that that's related to that archaeological trench, which means that this disturbance right here, that hotspot right there that continues, might be related to that. And then you can see it here in the gradiometer data that there's something that they were trying to catch, but maybe they were just a little too west or too east of it and didn't quite get it. But so some interesting results. We're not really sure what it is, but maybe a trench feature, and then maybe this weird semicircle of like post holes or something like that. So a little interesting stuff at Elk Landing. The next survey was conducted in November of 2024 at Abingdon. Excuse me. And in this survey, we spent time doing all three of those methods again. That's the gradiometer, the magnetic susceptibility, and the GPR. Our biggest obstacle here was that the field was currently in crop. It was all cover crop, so the farmer was like, yeah, you can just run right over it, or, you know, you can even mow it if you want. But the biggest radishes I've ever seen in my entire life are popping up all over the place, and as you can see in this photo, they are the size of my head. But we did persevere, and we managed to get the whole field surveyed, which is really great. So here in Bushtown or Abingdon, there are a few anomalies that look pretty interesting. The biggest is definitely this flaring over here to the east of the field. We do believe it's probably related to Harford furnace. So while no features popped up in our GPR survey here, the magnetic susceptibility meter was flaring wildly there. And then there is this kind of little yellowy red right here. This up here at the top, on the very, very north side, that is definitely the parking lot. There's like a slightly concreted and stoned over parking area near the road. And that can make the magnetic susceptibility meter go wild. So that's 100% what that is. But these other ones in the middle of the field might be catching something a little different. And then if you look at the gradiometer data, you can see again that all the way to the east, something's going on there. It looks kind of funky. Again, if that's related to the Harford furnace that we know is there, it could be slag in the field or something like that. And then in the western area, you kind of see on the northern tip that there's these flares going on right here. Some smaller ones more towards the road, but these ones are certainly interesting because of how they line up, going back to this with the magnetic susceptibility meter survey. But it's really interesting, and I'm going to pull up for you guys. This is our ground penetrating radar, and this is actually, I'm going to show you guys the actual video data that we have. So it's probably too small to see, but it goes in 10 centimeter increments, so you're going to see it kind of like phasing out and in. So if I move it forward, you can start to see things kind of take shape. And right there, you see those little trench features kind of going on the left-hand side. We're not really sure what those are. They look like little trenches. They're about 2 to 3 meters in size and 1 meter deep. So it's something potentially interesting. And if you didn't catch it, I will replay it for you guys so you can re-see it again, hopefully. So towards the right side of it. There's a couple of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe a fifth one towards the western side of the grid. Our current working theory is that they may be related to the camp latrines. But further excavation, however, is definitely necessary. So this is also an area that we may be interested in doing metal detecting. However, the landowner has told us that for years, with and without permission, people have been metal detecting here. So while there still may be something out there to find, it might not be a whole lot. related to the Revolutionary War, unfortunately. So that's all the data we have done and processed. 2 weeks ago, we did complete survey at the Deer Creek Friends Meeting House, but we're still processing that and making it look a little bit nicer. But we didn't really see anything. We were really hoping to catch some features related to the original meeting house before it burned down. Again, that magnetic susceptibility meter survey, we were really hoping would show us where that burned kind of area was. But unfortunately, nothing really popped in the data so far. And then while we were out of the site, we did also conduct a field walkover behind the meeting house in the farm field. We were hoping maybe through years of plowing, something would have kicked up any visual cues of historic use in that area. But again, unfortunately, we didn't see a single artifact on the surface. So not even just Revolutionary War related, but nothing else. No brick, no ceramics, nothing like that. So this past week, we were also out at a mill site associated with the Deer Creek Mission, which is also known as the Priest Neal House in Churchville kind of area. We did find what could be related to a mill race and a field wall in that area, but it's not a very geophysical survey friendly area, so we will likely be concentrating our survey efforts towards other areas in the vicinity. We've been speaking with a landowner nearby, and hopefully we can go out and check out his fields again, kind of see if anything had kicked up over the years, anything's on the surface, or if he's seen anything that he might think is related to the encampment sites. So other projects going on, as I mentioned earlier in the recap, we are pursuing that, other avenue of interpretation of the Deer Creek Church. And that is for a few reasons. So as far as we can tell, there are no sources that specify the Quaker Meeting House as the location of the bivouac. And when I say bivouac, that's just a nice term for a short camp. So basically a quick down and out rest stop, essentially. It's only called the Deer Creek Church, and it's labeled as such on their maps. So it doesn't say the Quaker Meeting House or anything like that. And then the French journals note distances that seem to match up better with this location of the Deer Creek Mission, which was a Catholic mission that was operating a mill from about 1740 through 1800. And so this is the birthday map where it shows Deer Church right here. It's kind of on this side of the road, and then the encampment site was actually there. But then we found this map from 1797, and that shows the Deer Creek Church here. Again, hoping you can see my little laser pointer. So it says the Deer Creek Chapel, but then to the east of that is the Quaker Meeting House. So it shows them as actually separate. So while we are still pursuing the Deer Creek Meeting House as a site of interest, we are also hopefully going to look deeper into the possibility of it being this mission house, and we're talking with the landowners nearby. So hopefully something pans out. And then looking forward, we have spoken to the landowners of and adjacent to Cummings Tavern in Cecil County, and they have given their preliminary blessing for us to come out and conduct a survey on their property. So that will hopefully be midsummer. And we invite you all to reach out to us if you're interested in assisting with survey, because this is a public archaeology project, and we have had volunteers come out and help us with all of these parts. And then, as mentioned previously, that next step after conducting the geophysical survey is to conduct ground truthing survey at least 2 sites identified in the survey, one on Harford County and one in Cecil County. And we have not determined which sites yet will be excavated, but that will likely be a decision for this summer. So hopefully we'll have some more information. And then finally, we will be hiring a consultant, hopefully this summer as well, to work on expanding the National Register of Historic Places form for Rogers Tavern. It was chosen due to its significance to Maryland's legacy with the American independence and the strong potential for new information to be added to the listing, which will include elements of the tavern story that are relating to enslaved labor, and other sorts of information that kind of got left out of that first iteration of the National Register nomination. And then a second property in Harford County will be selected for National Register documentation. Our architectural historians at MHT are currently in talks with some landowners to see which property is best suited for this nomination under the grant. So hopefully stay tuned for more information about that. And so I'll keep this up for a little bit, just in case you want to scan the code. So, like I said, this is a public archaeology project. We are always actively looking for people to volunteer with us on these projects. If you just want to get updates on this project, the same QR code can be scanned. And then if you have any information, like if your friend Jim was walking his farm fields one day and found a button that looks like it has French insignias on it, let us know. We would love to know. We're trying to hunt down more places to look so that we kind of do our due diligence for this grant. But as a rule, anyway, you can always contact MHT if you find artifacts or anything like that and want to report them. But specific to this grant, you can either scan that QR code, or you can go online on our website, MHT. We have a whole section on the Rochambeau grant to get information and things like that. So we'd love to hear from you all if you have any information or just want updates. And before I end, I really want to say thank you to our partners for this project, not just the National Park Service for their funding opportunity, which is extremely helpful, but everybody that's kind of come in after the fact. So the Archaeological Society of Maryland always provides us volunteers when we need their help. And then the landowners, especially just the private landowners, but also governments. So Cecil County Public Schools, the town of Elkton, Harford County, Maryland, and the town of Perryville, and the Historic Elk Landing Foundation. They are all landowners, and they've also been helping us with support for, helping and contacting with landowners, providing staff time to come out and help, or navigating any additional permissions we need in order to do this survey work. So this project would not have been successful, and going forward, it will not be as successful without their help, which has been really instrumental overall. And that about wraps up my update. So if anybody has any specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. I see one question from Frederick.
Yes, I do. Sorry about that. So would a camp kitchen, what would a camp kitchen look like in the ground? At the Bolton, Connecticut site, we found a circular thing in quotation marks, and I said it was a camp kitchen based on my digging reproductions at events.
That's a really great question. I don't think we have a specific example of what a camp kitchen would look like in the ground, and that's why we were really hoping that this would be a good opportunity to find them. I think the reason we thought that the rectangular anomalies at Elkton would be camp kitchens was because it wasn't very deep. It was actually, if I'm remembering right, it was probably only about 10 centimeters deep, which we were thinking maybe it's a packed earth floor or something like that. So that's kind of what we were thinking about, is like, especially if the anywhere it was had been graded or anything like that, and only thing is left is that packed earth part of the bottom. So I guess it would depend on what your circular thing looked like, but that's to us kind of what we were sort of thinking, is that it would look either circular or rectangular, 15 to 16 feet across, and then it could potentially be not very deep, more of a packed earth kind of style, if that makes sense. Hope that helps. I hope you guys found, I hope you found a camp kitchen. If you do confirm it, let me know. I would love to see that.
Yeah, I would too, out of curiosity.
Yeah.
So Alan asks, what were camp kitchens made of?
They were earthenworks. So they were either locally sourced clay or dirt. If I can go back, let me see if I can go back in my slideshow and I can pull up that photo again, because this is a reproduction one, obviously, but it does show. There you go. Okay. So as you can see, this bottom one, it's kind of got this lump of earth, and then each side, I think there's anywhere from 6 to 8 side holes, essentially, where they would actually put their bread into that. That's where the oven is, and the fire is more in the middle. So that's what they kind of look like, and that's what they're made of, is just their earthen structures.
Basically something that could be put together quickly.
rapidly.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, so he says, could they make them in a day? They were meant to be built quickly. However, so they would likely have been at Elk Landing, because they were there for a few days. And we were thinking maybe they might be in Bushtown because they were coming in waves. So that first group would get there. We were wondering maybe if they were there for the night, they would start building the oven, and basically every person that came behind them could use it in succession. So I don't know exactly how long it would take them, but they were very rapid, and we were hoping that, um, yes, in theory, they could make them very quickly. In regards to the movement up north, where they were basically marching until they had a second to stop. They would sleep basically on the ground real fast and then get back up. They likely did not have time to make these ovens at all. So
You had mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that you were focusing on troop movements,
mhm.
but you also mentioned that there were camp followers, wives and daughters, their children, families of the soldiers would follow along too. Um, have you, or do you think you might come across evidence of camp followers?
We haven't yet. At least not that we're aware of. Again, we won't start that ground truthing until probably later this summer or fall. Um, but likely, yeah. So everyone was basically there to help and assist with the troop movement. So, and especially when it comes to like the oxen pulling everything, they have bridle pieces, they have things that are attached to those types of things that could have fallen off very easily. Any sort of cooking utensils or things like that, or money. Um, that's probably what we're looking at, I'm assuming. And from the very limited primary documentation I've seen about camp followers, they didn't really bring a lot with them. But the problem is that the journals that we have and have seen, they don't really mention the camp followers. They're all like, all right, we stopped here for the day, and then I'm moving forward, and then I'm gonna move ahead, and I'm gonna scout out this section, and then I'm gonna get on my horse and come back. And they're very like back and forth and back and forth. So unfortunately, not a lot of information that I know of about that.
That's a shame.
It is. It is. And that's what I said in my thing that I'm very interested in conflict archaeology. Um, the battlefield sure is interesting to me, but I really am more interested in the what happens in the periphery. So I'm more interested in how civilians reacted with troop movement. I am more interested in the prisoner of war and internment camps, or even just like this encampments. And I'm very interested in the camp followers, like what their life was like. So I really hope we do find out more about them.
So one of the things that I've heard is that officers would stay with or stay in taverns or with prominent families in the area. Is that actually true?
It is. It is. At least everything that we have seen so far. We do know that people were staying in, or the officers were staying at Cummings Tavern. They were staying at Porter's Mill. They were likely staying at the Bush Hotel instead of at the encampment itself. And we do know they were staying at Rogers Tavern as well. I've seen a few, especially talking about the one was like, oh, the tavern keeper's daughter was fair, and or something like that. And
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's some question about the timing as to
Mhm.
whether or not it's Cecil County or Harford County
Yep.
side of the Lower Ferry
Yep.
and who the tavern keeper is at that point in time. In
Hmm.
1781, it is John Rogers, but in
Hmm.
1782, it's Alexander McCaskey who Steph, side note, I'd love to talk to you about prisoners of war because Alexander McCaskey was a prisoner of
Hmm.
war
Okay.
in 1781. So maybe some point in the future you might be willing to
Yep.
come back to talk about prisoners
Um,
of war and what their experiences were like.
sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
Hopefully that means I answered them
Oh,
in the presentation.
Well, I think you did a wonderful job, Stephanie.
Thank
There
you.
was a lot of information, and it's a very big project
It is.
to be taking on with multiple sites, and um, we look forward to hearing more about it, particularly as the summer progresses and you get to do
Yeah.
some ground truthing.
Yes, we are very excited about that. Hopefully, this time next year, we'll have some preliminary results of that. That'd be really great.
And I know I personally would love to be able to talk to your architectural historian consultants that you end up hiring, and invite them back too to see, or invite them to talk about what they've found in their work on not only Rogers Tavern, but also in the yet to be determined site in Harford County.
Absolutely. I'm sure they would be happy to.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up, everyone. So just to let you know that our next and last lecture for the Rogers Tavern Spring Lecture Series is on May 17th, also at 6:30 p.m., where we'll have Al Walton and Richard Haffer from the Perryville Railroad Museum. We'll be talking about the history of the railroad in the Perryville area. They've had a big, significant impact on the development of the town of Perryville. So that is also free. Registration is required, though. And Stephanie, thank you again and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.